questions.
So I want to piggyback on what you just said, because I think that sets the contrast with what I've seen from my experience, especially in Venezuela. You have these local spaces, the communal councils and all the instances of participatory deliberation that came after the Constitution. So it was just the development of what initially was promoted as a participatory democracy. Okay, so these spaces of local decision making, they took shape from a top-down process. It wasn't born down in the communities. It was brought by the central government. So the problem that I see here, and this is what Janina was asking about, the instrumental nature of these spaces of decision, is I think they do bring some sense of legitimacy, at least from their perspective. The government, the central government. Okay, we are giving people have the opportunity to participate, but this is not governance. Why? For example, in these communal councils, people would address their problems with basic utilities, which have been a problem for Venezuela, especially in the provinces. Okay, no water, electricity fails, and so on. So, you know, streets and schools and so on. So they might deliberate and they might come to some agreements. They might have the diagnostics, they might have the solution, but the problem is who has the resources? And the resources are way high up in the scale of public administration. These communal councils have the money for other needs. And like Janina said, we have a lot of corruption in as a backdrop for this. So you might have the intention to address these problems, but the budgets, these communal councils, at least from my own field work, that was never enough to address the real needs. We're talking about infrastructure. That's not enough. What we found from the reports of the government is that these communal councils would probably give people some access to goods and services that were not enough to close that gap between what they need as a community and what they have access to. So that's one thing, resources. But what I do think is that these spaces are excellent. If we're going to conceptualize them, these are excellent for diffusing threats against the government. Like you said, Sue, we're gonna let people decide at the lower level, whatever they want to decide, but that is not going to translate into policies. Janina, trying to respond to your question, this is not participation. This is barely consultation. That's not going to be binding in any case. They are giving the people the opportunity to experience what would be participation, but this is not tied to decision making. The decision making is at the elite level. So I think if that helps, this is absolutely instrumental, but what we have seen so far is that it has nothing to do, it has no impact on the decision-making process, and therefore it doesn't solve people's problems.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe, Sue, if you want to take the second question, or I don't know the order now, regarding democratic governance, because I think this was also is something controversial. I would like to listen. What do you think?
Okay, so I think, of course, it's very difficult to get around it by saying democratic governance, but having a very authoritarian, non-democratic government as the backdrop. So I know it's not easy to reconcile that. But I think if you look at some of the, if you just break it down in a very disaggregated manner to look at what does democratic governance actually entail, right? Certain things like responsiveness and also the ability of people to provide their input, that's still a people-centric sort of focus. I think to a certain extent, at the local level, but when it comes to participatory budgeting, and also going back to Maria's point, I think maybe I didn't clarify. At the national level, I think the recommendations do not get translated, but actually at the local level for participatory budgeting, the people's votes and the decision actually do get to be discussed and eventually can be translated into policy outcome. And it's also to the, that's because it's to the authorities' benefit as well to sort of implement projects, development projects in the locality that the people want, rather than guessing what the people want, which is the whole point of participatory budgeting. So I think at the local level, and this has been also shown and done in several studies, that it has actually generated a good outcome, and people are by and large pretty satisfied with that. They see that it has been, their voices have been heard and translated into concrete actions, which is why participation has sort of continued, and that process of participatory budgeting has been institutionalized. So, but back to the point about democratic governance, as I meant, maybe democratic governance might make people very uncomfortable. Maybe at the end of the day is responsive governance. I think that's something that the Chinese government has been quite well known for, and they also explain its ability to stay in power. This idea of authoritarian sort of resilience, because they are able to create input sort of institutions to allow people to participate in very selected control areas. And here, I think I want to really emphasize on the control, that I'm not in any way naive about the motivation and rationale behind the implementation of these participatory practices. Ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party will be controlling these processes. They are managing these processes, and in a very recent development, because of the current president's sort of focus and desire to ensure strong party sort of control and rule, these participatory processes have taken what I would call a party focus in a lot of the, because I'm not able to do field work now in China, but from the media reports, you can see how they frame participatory processes. While they are saying that people are happy and people think that participation and deliberation is the way to go to resolve local conflicts, and then they start to bring in how this also serves and sort of enhance the party vision. So you start to see a lot more of these inclusion of the party, which refers to the political, the Chinese Communist Party. So I would say, maybe going back to Yanina's point, that this whole idea of democratic governance right now is less and less resonant and less convincing, I would have to admit as well.
I don't know if it's worth to say, but what if there is an authoritarian governance? They develop the skills to use certain tools to not just keep them empowered, but to diffuse these threats against their regimes.
Sorry, I think this is a very interesting question. And in a way, I always think about if the ends justify the means, meaning yes, is to make sure that the regime stays in power. But what if you have somewhat positive outcomes where the people do feel that, okay, at least my opinions have been taken into consideration? And of course, in authoritarian regimes, such participation is in very, very restricted area. Like I would say participatory budgeting at the end of the day is still fairly non-sensitive. If you want to look at deliberation in like other topics like, I don't know, human rights, of course, this is inconceivable and would never be allowed. So I think authoritarian regimes are smart to allow and open up spaces of participation in selected areas, which can still help to increase the sense of legitimacy. At least the people are somewhat appeased and feel that my opinions are taken into consideration in some areas. And then authoritarian sort of participation or participatory authoritarianism or authoritarian governance might not necessarily be an entirely negative thing, or is not always negative. I mean, of course, we need to be very mindful of where some of the dangers lie, but I think we shouldn't always look at it in such a one-dimensional and negative way. There could be some good unintended outcomes. So, I mean, I know this is very controversial, but this is something that I constantly have to ask myself, is it always bad and negative, right?
Now we have a few minutes to arrive to the end. I think the topic will stay on the table and we will need to follow. But I want to, for these 3-4 minutes we have, to go back to this, to my question on, it makes sense to talk about participatory authoritarianism and something as something opposite to participatory democracy. And I wonder, because I think it's clear when we are in front of an authoritarian regime, but the models of participatory democracy are quite weak. So I wonder, it makes sense, the definition, or we should work more on what defines a model of participation and some conditions to classify different models and have more diversity between one extreme and the other. Of course, it's a difficult question, so I'm just asking for your impression, your quick impression on the point before ending.
And I think it's important, Janina, that very observation you're making, because we are watching that the liberal influence, you know, it's not about ideology, it's about the methods. It's about the mechanisms. At GAPAC, we have a paper about the liberal influence of China in Latin America. And what we have found is that it doesn't matter if it's a right wing or left wing issue. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do I reach power and how do I keep power? And that's why all these categories sometimes are not useful, are not helpful for us to understand the process. It's not working because probably we're stuck with those definitions that we used to in political theory. But right now we have to kind of review, take a step back and look at the different map that we have right now, because it is very complex and it's not like how we used to frame the discussion about left or right. This is about probably democracy and illiberalism. And there's a combination. You have people on the left supporting Putin, and it doesn't make sense, but it does make sense when it comes to the instruments and the methods.
I really agree with Marie, and I think sometimes I ask myself, when the lines are already so blurred, does it make sense to be so fixated with sort of categorization? Of course, from an academic, intellectual point of view, it does make sense as a kind of analytical category. But maybe because I also work with the NGOs, so on the ground, I was like, do they care if it's participatory authoritarianism or participatory democracy? Probably not. Because on the ground, there are a lot more complexities and it defies categorization. I think a lot of the strategies that these societal actors are able to come up with to fight for some spaces of participation, to contest power in very, very small, even indirect ways, I think is quite incredible and sometimes really is very hard to put in the categorization. But as a kind of broader reflection for us to think about, I think it's also important to think about why we want to do that and for what purpose and what are the implications that we have if we want to sort of define and refine the understanding of what participatory authoritarianism means. I mean, this is a probably ongoing reflection that I will have to undertake. And I think, and also invite other people working on this topic to also do the same. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We arrived to the end. I want to thank again all the institutions behind the promotion of this series of webinars. My feeling is that we have just started with this conversation on participatory authoritarianism, and it's much more to discuss. And then I find also highly productive to have this, like, it's not global, but to somehow from very different perspectives approaching the topic. My thanks again to Azucena for leading this initiative, and we remember everybody that there